Music. Music is something in your great-grandmother's kitchen that you will never find in yours. Not because it went out of fashion, not because taste shifted, or better options came along, or the modern palate moved past it, but because it was removed from the American food supply, systematically, legally, deliberately, over the course of roughly 50 years, and replaced with something cheaper, more profitable, something your body does not recognize as food, no matter how many decades it has been forced to process it. And the removal was so complete, so total, so culturally thorough that most Americans alive today have never tasted the original and have no idea it's missing. I'm talking about animal fats, specifically tallow, lard, and butter as the foundational cooking fats of the American diet. The fats that every human civilization relied on for millennia. The fats your ancestors cooked with, preserved with, baked with, healed with, and survived on through winters, famines, ocean crossings, and the settling of a continent. Fats that were not just food but medicine, not just sustenance but survival itself, and within a single century, they were replaced by seed oils, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, industrial products extracted through chemical processes that didn't exist before the 1900s, from crops that no civilization in human history had ever used as a primary source of dietary fat. Products that required factories, hexane solvents, deodorizers, and bleaching agents to become edible. Products your great-grandmother, if she tasted them in their unprocessed form, would not have recognized as food. And we were told this was progress. This raises a simple but critical question. How does a civilization abandon the foods that sustained it for thousands of years and adopt industrial replacements within a single lifetime? The answer, the deeper I went, was not nutrition science. It was money. It was industry. It was one of the most successful campaigns of dietary manipulation in human history. And it began not in a laboratory, but in a soap factory. Start with Procter Gamble, because this story begins with soap. In the early 1900s, Procter Gamble was a soap and candle company that developed a process for hydrogenating cottonseed oil, turning a liquid industrial waste product into a solid white substance resembling lard. The original purpose was to create a cheaper raw material for soap and candle production. But someone at the company looked at this white, solid, odorless substance and saw something else, not soap, food. If you could convince the American public that this hydrogenated cottonseed oil was a suitable replacement for the animal fats they had cooked with for their entire history as a species, the profit margin would be extraordinary. Cottonseed was a waste product of the cotton industry. It cost almost nothing. Lard and tallow came from animals that had to be raised, fed, slaughtered, and processed. The economic incentive was overwhelming. In 1911, Procter & Gamble introduced Crisco. The name came from crystallized cottonseed oil. The marketing campaign that accompanied its launch was, by the standards of its era, revolutionary. Procter & Gamble didn't just advertise Crisco. They published a free cookbook and sent it to every household they could reach. The cookbook contained recipes specifically designed to use Crisco in place of lard and butter. Recipes that embedded the product into the daily cooking routine of American homes. They marketed Crisco as modern, clean, scientific, the enlightened alternative to animal fats, which they characterized as heavy, old-fashioned, and unhealthy. They gave Crisco to hospitals. They gave it to schools. They gave it to Jewish communities, marketing it as parve, a product neither meat nor dairy, so it could be used in any meal under kosher dietary laws. They infiltrated every institution that influenced eating habits, and they did it with the precision of a military campaign. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. because Crisco wasn't sold on its merits as a food. It was sold on its merits as a replacement. The entire marketing strategy depended on first convincing the public that the thing being replaced was bad. That lard was heavy and indigestible. That tallow was primitive, that butter was dangerous. That the animal fats which had sustained every human civilization in recorded history were suddenly, in the early 1900s, discovered to be harmful. Not through research, not through clinical trials. Through advertising, through repetition, through the slow, steady erosion of trust in the foods your grandmother's hands had known by feel. The deeper I went into the nutritional science of this period, the more the science started to look like an accessory after the fact. Because genuine scientific research on dietary fat didn't begin in earnest until decades after Crisco and its competitors had already conquered the American kitchen. The science followed the market. It didn't lead it. And when the science did arrive, it arrived in a form that perfectly served the interests of the vegetable oil industry. Ancel Keys. The name that changed everything. In the 1950s and 1960s, Keys proposed the diet heart hypothesis, the theory that saturated fat, the kind found in animal products, raises cholesterol, and that elevated cholesterol causes heart disease. His 7-country study, published in 1970, appeared to show a correlation between saturated fat consumption and heart disease mortality across different national populations. The study was influential beyond any reasonable proportion to its rigor. Critics noted, and have continued to note for decades, that Keys selected his 7 countries from a much larger dataset. That countries that didn't fit the hypothesis were excluded. That the correlation between saturated fat and heart disease disappeared when the full dataset was examined. That the study demonstrated correlation, not causation. That confounding variables, sugar consumption, smoking rates, physical activity levels, were not adequately controlled for. That the conclusions were at best premature. None of this mattered. The diet heart hypothesis was adopted by the American Heart Association. It was adopted by the United States government. The 1977 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the first comprehensive federal nutritional guidance ever issued, told the American public to reduce saturated fat intake and replace animal fats with vegetable oils. The U.S. government, using the authority of federal nutritional science, told 300 million people to stop eating the fats their ancestors had thrived on and to start eating industrial products manufactured from seeds. The silence was deafening when I looked for the voices that objected, because voices did object. Nutritionists, biochemists, clinicians who worked with actual patients rather than epidemiological datasets raised concerns from the beginning. They pointed out that traditional populations with high saturated fat consumption, the Maasai, the Inuit, the Tokelau Islanders, showed remarkably low rates of heart disease. They pointed out that the American heart disease epidemic had begun in the early 1900s, precisely when vegetable oils were entering the food supply and traditional animal fats were being displaced. They pointed out that the biochemistry of seed oils, their high concentration of omega-6, polyunsaturated fatty acids, their instability when heated, their tendency to oxidize and produce inflammatory compounds, suggested that these oils might be causing the very diseases they were supposed to prevent. These voices were marginalized. Their funding was cut. Their publications were rejected or ignored. Their careers were damaged. The institutional weight of the American Heart Association, the federal government, and the vegetable oil industry, which by the 1970s was a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, created an informational environment in which questioning the diet heart hypothesis was treated not as scientific inquiry, but as heresy, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. And here's what happened. While the nation followed the guidelines, Americans reduced their consumption of animal fats. They increased their consumption of vegetable oils. They did exactly what they were told to do. And heart disease rates didn't decline at the rate promised. Obesity rates exploded. Type 2 diabetes went from a relatively uncommon condition to an epidemic affecting tens of millions. Inflammatory diseases, autoimmune conditions, metabolic syndrome, all of them surged in the decades following the dietary shift. The country got sicker, not in spite of following the guidelines, but concurrent with following them. The official explanation collapses here, because the defenders of the dietary guidelines have spent 50 years explaining why the results don't match the predictions. Americans aren't following the guidelines closely enough. Americans are eating too many calories overall. Americans are too sedentary. The explanations multiply. The responsibility is always pushed back onto the individual. You're not doing it right. You're not trying hard enough. The guidelines are sound. You are the problem. But the deeper I went, the more the timeline told a different story. The story of a food supply that was fundamentally altered not by consumer choice, but by industrial strategy and government policy, in ways that removed foods the human body had evolved to process and replaced them with foods the human body had never encountered. Consider what lard actually is. It's rendered pig fat. It contains roughly 40% saturated fat, 40% monounsaturated fat, and about 10% polyunsaturated fat. Its fatty acid profile is remarkably similar to human cell membranes. It's stable at high temperatures. It doesn't oxidize easily. It has been used for cooking in virtually every pork, consuming culture on Earth for thousands of years. Your cells recognize it. Your digestive system processes it efficiently. Your body knows what to do with it. Now consider what soybean oil is. It's extracted from soybeans using a chemical solvent, typically hexane, a neurotoxin derived from petroleum. The crude oil produced by this extraction is then degummed, neutralized with caustic soda, bleached with Fuller's earth, and deodorized through high-temperature steam distillation. The finished product contains a high concentration of omega-6 fatty acids, which in excess promotes systemic inflammation. It oxidizes readily when heated, producing compounds that have been linked in laboratory studies to cellular damage. No human population in history consumed this substance before the 20th century. Your body has no evolutionary framework for processing it. Your cells have never seen it before. And this is what we were told was healthier. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the entire food industry, because the replacement of animal fats with seed oils wasn't an isolated event. It was the template, the model for how an industrial food product displaces a traditional one. You need three things: an industrial product with a better profit margin than the traditional food, a scientific-sounding justification for the replacement, however thin, and an institutional apparatus, governmental, medical, educational, willing to enforce the replacement through guidelines, recommendations, and the slow strangulation of the traditional product's market share. Butter was replaced by margarine. Whole milk was replaced by skim. Egg consumption was demonized for decades, based on cholesterol fears that subsequent research has largely debunked. Organ meats, the most nutrient-dense foods in the human diet, foods every traditional culture prized and preserved, became objects of disgust rather than nutrition. Bone broth, which had been a medicinal staple in every culture on Earth, virtually disappeared from the American diet. Fermented foods, preserved meats, raw dairy, all of them were marginalized, regulated, or outright banned, replaced by processed alternatives that were more profitable, more shelf-stable, more compatible with industrial food distribution, and less compatible with human biology. The deeper I went, the more the modern American diet looked less like the product of scientific understanding and more like the product of industrial optimization. Every change in the dietary guidelines, every nutritional recommendation from the last century, every shift in what Americans were told to eat and to avoid aligned more consistently with the economic interests of the food industry than with the health outcomes of the population following the advice. Not every time, not in every detail, but with a consistency that coincidence cannot comfortably explain. And here's what I keep returning to: the physical evidence. Your body is the evidence. The chronic disease epidemic in America is the evidence. The fact that the generation raised on the dietary guidelines is the sickest generation in American history is the evidence. The fact that diseases of metabolic dysfunction, conditions that barely existed when your great-grandmother was cooking with lard, butter, and tallow, are now the leading causes of death in the United States is the evidence. The evidence isn't hidden. It's standing on a scale in a doctor's office, wondering why it followed every recommendation and ended up here. I'm not telling you to throw away your vegetable oil tonight. I'm not telling you that lard is a miracle cure. I'm asking why the foods that sustained the human species for 100,000 years were replaced within a single century by industrial products that require chemical solvents and bleaching agents to become edible. I'm asking who benefited from that replacement and who suffered from it. I'm asking why the science that justified the replacement has been questioned by researchers for 50 years without the guidelines changing in proportion to the evidence. I'm asking why the dietary advice given to 300 million Americans more closely resembles a marketing strategy for commodity crops than a prescription for human health. I'm asking what your great-grandmother knew that you've been taught to forget. What she kept in that jar by the stove that you've never seen. What she rendered and stored and cooked with every day of her life that made her generation leaner, stronger, and less chronically ill than the generation that followed. The generation meant to improve upon her. Handed a bottle of vegetable oil and told it was the healthier choice. What else have we been handed and never thought to question?